Imagine standing on the edge of the known world, a land wrapped in mist, forests whispering with ancient gods, and Roman banners cutting across the horizon. It was the 1st century AD. The Roman Empire stood at its height, vast, unstoppable, and merciless, and on one of its farthest frontiers, in Britannia, a woman would rise from tragedy to shake the very foundations of that empire. Her name was Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, mother, warrior, symbol of defiance. But before she became a legend, she was a woman wronged, stripped of her dignity, her family, her freedom, until the only thing left to lose was fear. History remembers conquerors and emperors, but rarely does it stop to honor those who fought against them, especially when that someone was a woman, leading an army against Rome itself. This isn't just a story about war or revenge. It's about what happens when injustice becomes too heavy to bear. When one voice ignites a nation. Boudica's rebellion wasn't born from ambition, it was born from betrayal. The Romans had promised alliance to her husband, King Prasutagus, but when he died, they seized everything, his lands, his wealth, his people. Boudica protested, and for that, she and her daughters were brutally punished. So she did what no one expected. She turned her pain into power. She rallied tribes across Britain, people divided by centuries of rivalry, and united them under one cause: freedom. Can you imagine that? A woman, in an age when women had no political voice, commanding over 100,000 warriors against the mightiest army the world had ever known. How does one woman stand against an empire built on fear? How does she inspire men hardened by war to follow her into almost certain death? Perhaps it was her courage, or her conviction, or maybe the sheer righteousness of her cause. When her chariots rolled across the plains, with her daughters beside her, the Romans saw not just an army, they saw fury itself made flesh. The rebellion swept through Roman settlements: Camulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium, cities burned to the ground. For a moment, it seemed the impossible had happened. Rome was on the brink of collapse in Britain. But revolutions burn fast, and the empire, as always, struck back. At the Battle of Watling Street, Boudica's forces were outmatched, trapped between Roman discipline and their own chaotic courage. Thousands fell, and though her rebellion was crushed, her spirit refused to die. 2,000 years later, her bronze statue still stands on the banks of the Thames, facing Parliament itself. Not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder that power can be challenged, that injustice, no matter how great, can awaken something even greater, that sometimes one woman's fury can echo louder than an empire's glory. So when we ask, how could one woman lead thousands against the mightiest army in the world? Maybe the answer is simple: because she believed she could, and because she made everyone around her believe it too. This is the story of Boudica, the queen who dared to defy Rome. Picture a land of rolling green hills and ancient forests, a land where druids whispered to their gods beneath oak trees, and warriors painted themselves blue before battle. This was Britannia nearly 2,000 years ago, and then Rome came. In 43 AD, under Emperor Claudius, the Roman legions crossed the sea and invaded. Tens of thousands of soldiers, their shields gleaming in the mist, their discipline unmatched. Each step they took marked the beginning of the end for tribal independence. Some tribes chose alliance, hoping for peace and Roman favor. Others, proud and fierce, resisted and were crushed beneath iron and fire. Rome's message was clear: submit or vanish. Among the tribes that tried to navigate this new order was the Iceni, in what is now eastern Britain, the land of wide skies, rivers, and wild plains. Their king, Prasutagus, and his queen Boudica, ruled a people who were proud, skilled in horsemanship, and fiercely attached to their way of life. At first, Rome allowed them a fragile kind of autonomy. The Iceni were labeled a client kingdom, semi-independent, but bound by loyalty to Rome. They could keep their land, their customs, and their throne, as long as they paid tribute and kept quiet. It was an arrangement built not on trust, but on tension, like a sword balanced on its tip. To the Romans, Britannia was just another province to tax, another people to civilize, but to the tribes, Roman civilization felt like slow suffocation. Their gods dismissed as superstition, their warriors reduced to farmers, their daughters married into Roman ranks to buy peace that never truly came. And though the Iceni wore the mask of loyalty, resentment was growing, quietly, steadily, in the shadows of Roman forts. For nearly 2 decades, this uneasy peace held Roman governors expected obedience. They collected taxes, built roads, and established outposts, each one a symbol of control. But underneath the calm, Britannia was boiling. Imagine the feeling of watching foreign soldiers march through your land. Men who didn't speak your language, didn't honor your gods, and yet demanded your loyalty. Imagine knowing that the future your children inherit will no longer be your own. That was the world Boudica lived in. She smiled at Roman officials when she had to, but she saw what was coming. A reckoning between the old ways and the empire that thought it could erase them. History often calls this period peace. But it wasn't peace. It was pressure. And pressure, when ignored long enough, always finds a way to explode. In the heart of eastern Britain, the Iceni watched, waited, and endured. To the Romans, they seemed pacified. To the tribes around them, they seemed cautious. But in truth, they were waiting for the moment, the one spark that would turn their quiet anger into open flame. And when that spark finally came, it would come through a queen, a woman whose fury would make Rome tremble. Her name was Boudica. And this is how the storm began. Every great fire begins with a spark, and for Boudica, that spark came with loss, the kind that burns too deep to ever heal. It began around 60 AD, when her husband, King Prasutagus, died. For years, he had walked the impossible line between freedom and submission, loyal to Rome, yet clinging to his people's independence. In his final act, he tried to secure peace. His will left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to Rome. A compromise meant to honor the empire while protecting his bloodline. But Rome did not share his sense of honor. To them, the death of Prasutagus wasn't a moment for diplomacy. It was an opportunity for conquest. They ignored his will, claimed the Iceni lands outright, and sent soldiers to enforce their authority. The message was clear. The age of allies was over. From now on, Britannia belonged to Rome alone. When Boudica protested, they silenced her, not with words, but with cruelty. Historical sources tell us, though it's painful to imagine, that she was publicly beaten. Her 2 young daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers right before her eyes. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a message, a reminder of who held power, and who was expected to bow. But what the Romans didn't understand was that humiliation can sometimes awaken something far stronger than fear. It awakens fury. As her bruises healed, something inside Boudica hardened. The quiet queen who once sought compromise was gone. In her place stood a warrior, forged not by ambition, but by pain. She had lost her husband, her dignity, her land. And when you have nothing left to lose, you become unstoppable. Rome had ruled through intimidation for decades, believing that fear was enough to maintain control. But fear, when pushed too far, turns into defiance. The Iceni weren't alone. Other tribes, once divided by old rivalries, began to see their own reflection in Boudica's suffering. They, too, had lost land, pride, and freedom. And for the first time they saw in this woman not just a queen, but a symbol. One by one, banners rose across the countryside. The Trinovantes, the Cornovi, the Catuvelauni, names that had once meant separate nations, now stood together, all answering a single call: vengeance. Imagine the sight: flames lighting, the horizon, war drums echoing across forests, and thousands gathering beneath the storm-gray sky. A sea of warriors, men and women alike, united behind a woman whose voice had once been silenced, now roaring louder than any legion. When Boudica stood before her army, she didn't speak like a ruler. She spoke like a mother who had lost everything and refused to let her people suffer the same fate. She reminded them of their ancestors, those who once roamed free, untamed, unbroken. She reminded them of the gods of their homeland, of the oaths, the songs, the blood spilled defending sacred soil. And then she made them believe that this was more than revenge. It was redemption. Under her command, tribes that had spent generations feuding now fought side by side. The Romans had built their empire on the illusion of control, but they had never faced the fury of a united Britannia. From the ashes of injustice, a rebellion was born, A queen once beaten in chains now led over 100,000 warriors toward the heart of Roman power. If history teaches us anything, it's this. Empires fall not only from foreign invasions, but from the arrogance that blinds them. Rome believed Britannia had been conquered, but they had forgotten that beneath the ashes of every conquered land lies the ember of rebellion. And Boudica, the woman they tried to break, would be the wind that fanned it into flame. Out of the ashes of humiliation, a queen rose. Her name was Boudica, and she was no longer the grieving widow Rome thought she was. She had become something far greater, the voice of a people who had been silent for too long. Ancient writers say she was tall and fierce, her presence impossible to ignore. Her long red hair flowed down to her waist like living fire, a blaze that seemed to mirror the fury in her soul. When she spoke, her voice carried across the fields like thunder. She didn't need a crown or a palace to command respect. Her strength was her authority. To her people, she wasn't just a queen anymore. She was justice incarnate. Until that moment, Britain had never truly been united. Tribes fought among themselves for generations, each with their own chieftains, their own gods, their own grudges. But pain has a strange power. It binds even the fiercest of rivals. When word spread of Boudica's defiance, warriors began to gather. First, the Iceni, her own tribe, who had suffered under Rome's arrogance. Then came the Trinovantes, who had watched their sacred lands stolen to build a Roman colony at Camulodunum. Soon after, others joined, clans from across the east and beyond. Tribes who had once refused to fight side by side now marched beneath a single banner. In a land where loyalty was once divided by bloodlines and borders, one woman became the thread that wove them together, and by the time their ranks were ready, historians estimate there were more than 100,000 warriors under her command, a force so massive that even Rome, in all its arrogance, could no longer ignore it. Boudica didn't promise them wealth or conquest. She promised something purer: freedom. Freedom from taxation, from humiliation, from seeing their children grow up under a foreign flag. She spoke of honor, of restoring what had been stolen, of reclaiming not just their land but their dignity. To the Celts, freedom wasn't an abstract idea. It was sacred. It was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their songs, the fire in their rituals, and now, that sacred birthright had been trampled beneath Roman sandals. Boudica's speeches were said to move even the hardest warriors to tears. She reminded them of who they were before Rome arrived. Proud people of the earth, children of the gods, protectors of their ancestors' graves. And she vowed that no Roman soldier would leave their island alive. This was not a rebellion for negotiation. There would be no treaties, no compromises, no polite diplomacy between conqueror and conquered. Boudica's mission was clear: to drive Rome out of Britain completely. She wanted the empire to feel the same fear her daughters had felt. She wanted the Romans to look at the flames of their burning cities and know that Britannia could not be tamed. For the Romans, this was an uprising. For the Celts, it was a war for the soul of their homeland. Imagine it, across the misty plains, the sound of horns echoes in the dawn. Warriors paint their faces blue with woad, invoking their gods. Chariots gleam with bronze. Horses stamp the earth in anticipation, and at the front, Boudica stands, spear in hand, hair whipping in the wind, eyes burning with purpose. She doesn't ask her people to fight for her. She asks them to fight for themselves, for their ancestors, for their children, for the right to be free on their own soil. And, as the drums thundered and the chants rose, one truth became clear: Rome had conquered many lands, but it had never faced a queen like this. In that moment, on the eve of battle, the world tilted. An empire of stone stood against a queen of fire. And though the Romans had their legions, their walls, their discipline, Boudica had something they could never manufacture: belief. Belief that freedom was worth dying for. Belief that courage could outlast conquest. Belief that even in defeat, dignity could still triumph. And as her army began to march, the ground beneath Britannia trembled. Every rebellion begins as a whisper. And then, one day it roars. For Boudica, that roar began in the city of Camulodunum, known today as Colchester. Once, it had been the proud capital of Celtic power. Now under Rome, it had become the ultimate symbol of occupation. A colony for retired Roman soldiers, built right on the ruins of native land. They filled it with temples, statues, and walls that shouted Roman dominance. But to the tribes of Britain, those marble stones felt like a slap in the face, a monument to everything they had lost. So when Boudica's army appeared on the horizon, tens of thousands strong, the city's fate was already sealed. The Romans laughed at first. They thought it was just another small tribal skirmish. But then the gates fell. The flames rose, and the laughter stopped. Camulodunum burned for days. The Roman veterans, once soldiers of the empire, were hunted down in the streets they'd built. Their proud temple of Claudius, the symbol of Roman worship, stood alone for a moment, a fortress of arrogance amid the fire. And then, it too was consumed. The first blow had been struck. The message was unmistakable. Britannia was done kneeling. News of the slaughter raced across the province like wildfire. Rome's governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, rushed back from the west, where he'd been leading campaigns in Wales. When he reached Londinium, modern-day London, he was faced with an impossible choice. Londinium was young, prosperous, and filled with traders and settlers. But Suetonius looked at his exhausted legions, outnumbered 10-1, and realized a brutal truth. He couldn't save the city. So he made the hardest decision a commander can make. He ordered an evacuation. He left Londinium to burn. Moments later, Boudica's army swept in like a storm. No negotiation, no mercy. The city that had become Rome's commercial heart in Britain was turned to ash. Eyewitnesses, the few who escaped, wrote that thousands died in the streets. Roman roads ran black with smoke and red with blood. And when the fires died down, only the ghosts of Londinium remained. But Boudica wasn't done. Her fury drove her northward, toward Verulamium, known today as St. Albans, another Roman town. Another reminder of foreign control. The pattern repeated. The city's defenders stood no chance. Once again, the flames rose into the gray British sky. Homes, temples, markets, all reduced to ruin. To the Romans, these were cities of civilization. To the Celts, they were scars upon sacred soil. And now, those scars were being erased by fire. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 of Rome's most important settlements in southeastern Britain lay in ruins: Camulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium. 3 names that once defined Rome's power, now whispered as reminders of Rome's humiliation. Think about that for a moment. In just a matter of weeks, one woman, leading tribes once thought primitive, had brought the world's greatest empire to its knees. The same empire that had conquered Gaul, Egypt, and Greece, now watched helplessly as its British province burned. For the first time, Rome looked vulnerable. And across the empire, whispers began to spread. If Britannia can rise, who's next? But victory came at a price. As her army marched from city to city, the fires that symbolized vengeance also drained her forces, their supplies, their strength, their unity, and somewhere, deep in the forests ahead, the Roman governor was regrouping, waiting. For now, though, Boudica stood triumphant. The smoke of her victories darkened the sky. The Roman eagle, once a symbol of eternal dominance, trembled in the heat of her rebellion. She had done what no general before her had achieved. She had made Rome bleed. But, as history always reminds us, every fire burns, brightest before it begins to fade. Every revolution reaches its reckoning, and for Boudica, that reckoning came on a gray morning, somewhere along the ancient Roman road now known as Watling Street. For months, her rebellion had burned across Britain like wildfire. Cities turned to ash, legions scattered, governors humiliated. But in the end, empires don't fall quietly, and Rome, patient, disciplined, ruthless, was ready to strike back. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was no ordinary commander. He had seen rebellions before. He understood something that Boudica's warriors, fierce as they were, did not. Battles are not won by rage alone. Suetonius gathered what remained of his forces, perhaps 10,000 soldiers, a fraction of Boudica's vast army. On parchment, the numbers made no sense. Boudica had over 100,000 warriors, men and women, chariots and tribes united under one cause. But Suetonius didn't intend to fight them in open fields. He chose his ground with precision. A narrow defile, a valley with dense woods behind him and open land. Ahead, there would be no room for the Celts to surround his troops, no space for their chariots to maneuver. He turned the land itself into a weapon, and when his soldiers formed up, shields locked, spears braced, the iron heart of Rome was ready. When Boudica's army arrived, The earth itself seemed to tremble. Imagine it. The thunder of hooves, the cry of war horns, the chanting of tribes from every corner of Britain. A sea of warriors stretching as far as the eye could see, their faces painted blue, their weapons gleaming in the cold light. Behind them, wagons filled with families and spoils, the people who had followed their queen to war. Boudica herself rode among them, her long red hair streaming behind her like fire in the wind. She raised her spear high, calling on her gods, and her people roared in answer. Then, the Celts charged, but the narrow terrain worked against them. Their numbers, once their greatest strength, now trapped them. The Roman line held firm, shield to shield, like a wall of iron. Arrows whistled through the air, pilum spears flew, and when the Celts crashed into the Roman formation, discipline met chaos. The Romans moved as one, methodical, deadly, unyielding. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, but every advance was theirs. When the order finally came to counterattack, the legions surged forward like a machine of steel, and the great Celtic host, that once made the empire tremble, began to break. When it was over, the field was silent. Tens of thousands lay dead. Warriors, families, chariots shattered and burned. Rome had done what Rome always did, turned disaster into victory through sheer discipline and design. But what became of Boudica herself? That, like so much of her story, fades into mystery. Some say that when she realized defeat was inevitable, she took her own life, choosing death over capture. Others claim she fell ill and died shortly after, her body buried in a secret place, so that Rome could never defile it. No one knows where her grave lies. Some believe it's beneath a quiet field in eastern England. Others say it rests beneath modern-day London, hidden under layers of stone and time, the heart of the very empire she once tried to destroy. But perhaps that's how legends should end. Not with certainty, but with a question that lingers through the centuries. Boudica lost the battle, yes. But in losing, she became something greater than a conqueror. She became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the eternal refusal to bow. For centuries, poets and queens have spoken her name. Her statue stands today beside the Thames, her chariot forever charging forward, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can tremble before a mother's rage and a nation's dream of freedom. Because in the end, Rome may have won the war, but Boudica won immortality. History has a strange way of remembering people. Some conquerors build empires and vanish from memory, but others, those who stand against empires, live forever. And Boudica was one of them. She began as a queen from a small corner of eastern Britain. A mother, a wife, a leader of a tribe most of Rome barely noticed. But when the world turned its back on her, she turned and faced it. She took her pain, the loss of her husband, the cruelty toward her daughters, the humiliation of her people, and transformed it into something larger than herself, into resistance. Rome tried to erase her. They crushed her rebellion, destroyed her warriors, and buried her story under the weight of their victories. But they couldn't bury her spirit. Because every generation since has found something of themselves in her fight. To the Celts, she was vengeance. To the English of later centuries, she became a national icon. A woman who stood up when no one else dared. And to the modern world, she's something even greater. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage can rewrite history. Think about that for a second. A woman, with no army at first, no empire, no allies across seas, took on the most powerful civilization the world had ever seen, and terrified them. She nearly erased the Roman presence in Britain. For a brief, breathtaking moment, she made the unthinkable possible. The Romans never forgot her, even their historians. Men who usually glorified conquest wrote about Boudica with something close to awe. Tacitus described her as a woman of greater intelligence than is usual among women. Cassius Dio called her presence terrifying, and centuries later, her name would be whispered like a storm, not as a villain, but as a warning. To this day, her story remains a paradox. She fought for her people's freedom. With fire and fury, she lost everything, yet became immortal. If you walk along the Thames River in London, near Westminster Bridge, you'll find her still there, not as a ghost, but in bronze, a towering statue of Boudica in her war chariot, her daughters by her side, her hair flowing wild in the wind. She faces Parliament itself, the very heart of British power, as if to remind every leader who walks those halls. Power is not eternal. Freedom must always be defended. To some, she stands for justice, to others for courage, but to all, she stands for the eternal fight against oppression, for the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to be silenced. Her story forces us to ask some uncomfortable questions. What drives ordinary people to acts of extraordinary bravery? What turns pain into power? And how can one act of injustice ignite a fire that changes the course of history? Maybe it's because deep down, we all carry a piece of Boudica within us. That quiet voice that whispers, "Enough." That moment when fear gives way to fury, when endurance becomes rebellion, and when someone finally decides that being broken is not the same as being defeated. More than 19 centuries have passed since Boudica rode across the British plains. Empires have risen and fallen. The world she knew is long gone, but her story, her defiance, still burns, because the truth is, Boudica didn't just fight Rome. She fought the idea that some people are born to rule and others are born to obey. And that battle, the fight for freedom, dignity, and justice, is still being fought today, in every corner of the world. So maybe, in the end, Boudica never truly died. Maybe she's still out there, in every person who stands their ground when the odds are impossible, in every voice that refuses to be silenced, in every act of courage that dares to challenge the powerful, because empires fall, but courage endures.